Hi everyone, can you hear me now? All right, good afternoon and welcome. I am Kate Fellens from Strauss & Company, and it is my pleasure to welcome you all here today to the Art Business Conference in Cape Town for the first time. I am honored to be supporting this conference in collaboration with Africa First and Serge Tiroche, who's one of our panelists today. I have the pleasure of introducing Frank Kilbourne, our chairperson, who will speak briefly about Strauss and his passion for art, and then we'll be on to the conference. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kate. Good afternoon, everyone. A very warm welcome to Cape Town, most probably the busiest art center in the world this week. We're delighted to welcome you also at Strauss & Company's new home, which, as you will see, we are still in the process of fitting out completely, but we're very happy to welcome all of you here today. It's a special event for us because it's the first conference of this kind in Africa. The rest have been held across the continent, and we are delighted that this is another new addition to what we have. New offices, a new art exhibition that will be exhibited after, that you can visit afterwards, on curatorial voices, which I think is the first ever collaboration of 7 different curators presenting contemporary and modern art from Africa, from across the continent, in one collaborative effort. We're delighted to welcome you in Cape Town because I think if we can speak about Southern African art, it's most probably at the healthiest state it has ever been. And the reason for that is that the art ecosystem is really flourishing in Southern Africa. And why would we do that? Because clearly we have the artists in Africa as a whole that have the talent and art creative abilities to attract audiences across the world. And they now command respect in many instances in many international institutions. We have very strong private sector support for the arts, and we are very fortunate to have several privately funded institutions such as the Norval Foundation, Zeitz Moka, the Rupert Foundation, A4. All these institutions which are really supplementing the role of the state in a more developed society, where they would provide substance and depth in academic research, which in much of Africa there is still a dearth of. We have a very well-developed primary market. The galleries are really have access, fought their way into all the major art fairs across the world. So our top contemporary artists are actually getting the audience, and they're being seen on international fora, and that is obviously very important. We also have a very well-developed secondary art market, which is important to provide liquidity to the art market. I'm happy to say that even Art Monitor reckons that Strauss & Company is the leading auction house in Africa, and our vision is to be the most dynamic auction house in Africa, and we want to build that on the basis of our expertise, our commitment to technology. We are delighted today to be hosting this event in cooperation with our partners to start promoting dialogue about the art ecosystem on the continent. What is amazing about art is that art knows no boundaries. It doesn't recognize any rules. It's a freedom and exchange of impression, of thought, of ideas. In Africa, we've often been trapped by the fact that we had boundaries drawn somewhat arbitrarily in the past. And that trapped us often in the way that we communicated with our neighbors and with other people. And we often are being very focused on our internal dynamics. But the world has changed enormously, and it's so important today that we as a continent recognize that we as a continent have a special place in the world, and that we need to cooperate and collaborate in order to hold our own against other continents in the world. In the end of the day, there is an art market, and art is produced and it needs to be sold. To a very significant extent, African art are made in Africa, sold in the West for the West. And often when artists are actually really reaching their peak, they move to the West because that's where the market is. I don't think it's anything political, it's simple market dynamics. How do we counter that dynamic? We counter that dynamic by making sure that the art ecosystem in the whole of the continent is as developed as it can be, that we support and nurture and recognize artists, that we actually create a whole new collector base in Africa that is capable of sustaining that market and giving extra depth to the market. Unfortunately, in the big world out there, trends come and go, and sometimes your quality remains the same, the output remains the same, but the trend moves in a different direction. If you don't have a well-developed local continental market, you run the risk of falling out of favor, and a lot of the headway that we've made in the last 5 to 10 years can fall away. So it's extremely important that we extend the base of collectors across Africa, and and it's not only private collectors. It would be fantastic if we can reinvigorate corporates to start collecting contemporary African art. In many instances in the last 100 years, institutions such as these were very instrumental in building up significant collections, and that to a large extent has fallen by the wayside, I think. And it is so that South Africa, and I think the rest of Africa, is a place where there are a huge amount of social needs. There are always very good reasons to spend money on other things than art. But art is so important. It talks to the best in us, the most creative in us. It's a language that we all share across all the boundaries in this country. It promotes creativity. It promotes problem solving. It gives us something to talk about. It gives us something to debate and argue about. It stimulates discussion. It is provocative, it's nurturing, it's beautiful. It's the most crazy, amazing thing in the world, and it should be an ideal platform in which we celebrate. That's what we share, that's what we all love, notwithstanding the differences between us. So we really would hope through the exhibition that we're making and through hosting a platform such as today, that will enhance our ability to do exactly that. My own journey with art started to a large extent when I went to university, and one day I happened to come across an art exhibition that was opened by two of the major modern voices of South African art by the name Walter Batters and Eduardo Villa. And I was on my way to the Latin class, so you can imagine it didn't take a lot to deviate from Latin to go, and there was also wine being served and beautiful paintings up there, and I deviated and I went to get a glass of wine, and obviously that was the end of Latin. I was fortunate to study at the university where there was a huge amount of sculptures by Eduardo Villa. And I couldn't really figure them out. I grew up on a farm. My dad had one look at them and he said he doesn't know who made these things, but that guy can weld. So that was my sort of first introduction to the more abstract aspects of art, is the ability to make things properly, to weld, skill, craftsmanship. And that day Eduardo Villa spoke, and he spoke about his art and his story. It was mesmerizing. It changed my world. I walked out that day and I decided one day, if I'm fortunate enough, I want to become an art collector, and I want to build a representative collection of Southern African art. And as time developed, and that incredible inquisitiveness that underlies every art collector, and the deep desire to own the next thing or to explore the next thing, and the deep fear of boredom or something that drives us, lent you to look beyond our boundaries, to look what is happening in the rest of Africa. And slowly but surely you expand your horizons and start acquiring art from across the world. And it's an incredible journey to be on, because it doesn't only enrich your collection, but it enriches your understanding of the thoughts and the challenges that people face, the media that they use, why they're using them, the issues that they engage with. So it's an incredible access, it gives you an incredible access to the thinking in places outside of yourself. So I think that holds true for every collector, and potentially for all the major institutions in the country, that on the continent, that ever-expanding horizon of things that pique your interest. So it's really in the context of that I'd like to welcome you all today, and I invite you to participate vigorously in this conversation. We have some excellent panels that's been put together that will facilitate these discussions, and as you said at the back, please be provocative as soon as you can be. It's my pleasure to welcome Ria to the podium, who is an independent arts journalist and author. She's often contributed to the Art newspaper, and she flew in from London especially to chair this panel today, as she's done in other countries in the world. So welcome, Ria, and have a good afternoon, everyone.
Hello and welcome. It's really wonderful to be here. As you know, this is our first art business conference here in South Africa. And it's thanks to the support of Serge and Tarosh from Africa First and also Strauss & Co. So we're really excited to be here and see you all. I've been fortunate enough to be working with Strauss & Co. and Louise, who runs the Art Business Conference, for about a year now. We set up an Art Business Digest that goes out fortnightly, for any of you that haven't signed up. And we set it up, and there was obviously a lot of excitement in the air internationally around modern and contemporary African art when we did so. But we were quite shocked about the reception and the clear response we got from readers of the digest, and that sort of accelerated to the point where we're here today on the eve of the 10th anniversary of the Investec Cape Town Art Fair, with a room full of people interested to know more, and with a wonderful panel, which I'm about to introduce. So thank you for being here with us. For the first talk, we're going to focus a bit on the African art market, contemporary art in particular, and the art ecosystems that underpin that, particularly within the continent. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce you on my left to Serge Tarosh, who's the founder and CEO of Africa First. And to his left, Dana Ndundu Ferreira, founder of the Pavilion 54, and one of the collaborators on the curatorial voice exhibition, which is outside today. On my right, if I've got that correctly, yep, it is my right, this is Ugoma Ebela, who's the Nigerian business and art leader and does multiple projects, but is also an arts mentor. And then to her right, we have Tristan Farrell, who works with the Investec Wealth and Investment team, who support the Cape Town Art Fair. And then finally, we have Rose Crossthwaite, who's gallery support and sales enablement at Artsy. So we're really excited to have her with us today. So, thank you for coming. To kick off, I'm going to probably start with the same question for all of you. As you know, there's a lot of talk around it being a real moment of growth and acceleration for interest collecting and investing in art from Africa. There are a lot of big headline figures. I know that the Art Tactic report reported that South Africa in particular had exceeded its sales by four-year high, and that there were it's a record sale last year. But I guess what I want to do is explore a little bit whether you think overall there is a trend towards in collecting, and what you think it is that's accelerating the sort of dialogue around African art, particularly from an international perspective at this point before we move into the continent. So I wanted, Serge, if you'd be happy to take a lead on that first point. There should be a mic. I'll pass that along. There we go.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming. It's a pleasure to co-sponsor this with Strauss, and what a great panel we have, and hope you enjoy the afternoon. Yeah, let's make it interactive. I think that's great, and I don't know when we're supposed to take questions, but it would be great to
I think we'll have time at the end.
Have the public participate as well. To go back to your question, I've been collecting African art since 2010, roughly, contemporary African art. But I think what really triggered the change that we're experiencing now was, for me, it was the 154 Art Fair. Mm-hmm. I always credit Turia, who's a good friend, for really bringing African art from all over the world to the forefront, and providing visibility to a lot of artists and galleries. And I really think that kicked off the economy of the market that we know today. Obviously, that also is about infrastructure and providing visibility. But beyond that, and that's a private sector initiative, and I think that's where the world is moving in general, but particularly in Africa, like Frank mentioned, a lot of the infrastructure is due to private sector initiatives. And Africa First, I founded in 2017, and that's another sort of part of the puzzle. It's also, I see it as an infrastructure platform. The collection is the core of it, but beyond that, there's a lot of other activity that's there to bring artists from Africa and give them visibility internationally, and support their practice and see them, grow their careers, and get picked up by major international galleries. That's the end goal at the end of the day. And a lot of that, eventually feeds back onto the continent, be it in the form of capital, or artist residencies that artists who are successful in the West are creating in Africa. It's wonderful to see so much of that happening. So yeah, I mean, I think that's really for me the 154 is. I think it was 2015 or 16 when it started. That really sort of kicked off the era that we're in today.
No, I've heard a couple of you mention that. And Dana, is that, from your perspective, is it that international sort of platform you think that's been given is accelerating things?
Yes, no, I definitely think that the development of art fairs and new museums being started within the continent and internationally, and also museums internationally bringing more shows about like African artists or black artists, made it like accelerated the appetite for people around the world. I also think that there are some socio-economical or pop culture kind of like factors that contributed to it. I'm thinking about the whole movement of Black Lives Matters and all those things, Nigeria being in the front of like cultural expansion with the music, the cinema and everything. And it made kind of, I think, the world being ready and being more willing to hear African voices and black voices. So it was also kind of like a timing thing, things happening at that particular moment that also definitely increased the interest that people had in art from Africa and the diaspora.
And when we talk about timing, we've had a global pandemic thrown in just for some extra acceleration for everything. And Rose, you obviously work with a digital platform. I wonder to what extent you think that's had an influence. Gives you a nice bit of excitement.
Okay.
Here we go.
Sorry. I think following on from Dana's point of the socio and economic changes and situations, we've seen artsy collectors be much more socially conscious with collecting based on specific groups, whether it's women artists or queer artists or artists that are coming from their heritage or based on what their heritage is. And that's something that I think Artsy has been wonderful at expanding, and working with the fairs as well and auction houses are something that we've seen great impact on. Yeah.
Wonderful. And Tristan, I'm going to go to you now. Obviously, you've been working with the Cape Town Art Fair for a long time, or 10 years now.
Yep.
Obviously, the collecting profile within that time has probably expanded, become more international, by sounds of it, and deepening quite majorly. I wonder from your experience to what extent you think it's become more international, what sort of factors have contributed to that?
Yeah, so I think my view is more from maybe a personal perspective as well, where I'm thinking the fair does have, we've got foot traffic grown from about, I think, 10,000 or so to about 23,000 people now. Of that, about 3,000 are international visitors who actually fly down for the fair. I agree with the 154 comment, because I think having a footprint next to Frieze does give you that good exposure. And I was chatting to Rose earlier saying how addicted I am to Artsy as well since like the pandemic. You know, everyone went online and you shopped online, and I watched Bina when she was doing her auctions like I was watching TV. So, you know, it became quite addictive, and I think that sort of geographic footprint did expand through that social media as well, because you had such a big reach. And I know I was speaking to a lot of the Strauss crew here, and they have said their international base has grown significantly. So I think it really is about the exposure, the fairs, the international kind of platforms we use, Instagram, anything like that. And hopefully our fair now, this week, hopefully all attending, is the biggest fair in Africa at the moment. And it's got a really good exposure to international and local galleries. I also think on that point, the galleries do take a lot of our artists to the international fairs, and that costs them out of their own pockets, and I think that's a big commitment on their side, and I think it's really significant.
That's true. You've gone for the mic before I even had to introduce you.
I wanted to add to her point, but you can...
No, please do.
I agree entirely. I think that, of course, 154 and Surge, definitely. But just as the gentleman who opened the panel mentioned, I think it's been an interesting time where all of the work has overlapped. There's been so much work on the galleries, so much investment in terms of personal investments of collectors in the galleries, so they were ready. The artists have been also in a much more ready place because of the work of people like Bissy Silva, curators getting deeper and deeper into actual production. So the output is great, the infrastructure is great, the galleries are ready, the fairs and the private sector are standing up. And so it's an interesting time where a lot of these things have overlapped. I wouldn't want to say one has triggered the other more than the other, because I think that what is obvious is that, as the word we're using, ecosystem, which we don't really like, but an ecosystem is that there's so many parts, and as long as everyone understands those parts, the educational side, the private sector side, even understanding supportive sponsors, you know, because it's also very rare to have a sponsor speak for a fair. If you've produced anything in culture, you know that it's usually at loggerheads with your sponsor. Your sponsor is usually trying to extract. Now we're seeing all this involvement. To speak to digital, of course, there was a moment where we all had to be quiet for about 2 years and started to focus on what really mattered. And maybe it turns out that as a culture, art matters to us, expression matters to us. So all these factors, ecosystem parts, have nicely come together. And the key now is, what do we do next to take it forward and keep it sustainable?
And actually, you pointed out, we don't hate the word ecosystem, but obviously we're just conscious that, you know, it's quite a sweeping statement, and some of the other things we've discussed, obviously, when we're talking about art from Africa, it's quite a big term. Africa's actually like 54 countries, so is it, you know, are we oversimplifying things? Similarly with the art market itself, it's quite dangerous to talk about just the art market, when in reality it's a number of markets, you know, functioning together and at different levels. So I think we're all discussing that with a sort of consciousness to those terms as well. So I think there's some clear factors, at least from the international perspective, and it sounds like what you're talking from there does seem to be a genuine investment from international fairs, etc., to genuinely understand the continent and what's going on here. And I'd quite like to move on next to actually the ecosystem, if we can use that within the continent, and to what extent we think it's supporting the market's growth, the strengths, and some of the challenges that are facing that. And I might actually go back to you, Gomez, because I know you work at quite grassroots level with quite a lot of artist organisations. So to what extent is that important, and how is it doing?
I think, you know, the term Africa is so wide. I will speak to the Nigerian story, and I'm happy that, you know, Dana talked about Nigeria, because, you know, I'm in Nigeria, and I sometimes take it for granted how electric our existence is. You know, there's so many horrible stories and there's so many wonderful stories, but stories are what art is made of. And so I will speak about the Nigerian context, which is that it's a very, we're going to do what we have to do spirit. And in so many ways, I think that permeates through the artists, it permeates through the collectors. And this moment we're seeing is almost like it's been taken by force. I can't really say there's any particular reason why we decided that we were just going to be a bit louder, a bit more present. I can't. It's not actually the story about the military, because the military left us a while ago. It's not COVID, because COVID just happened. So for some reason, there was a renaissance. And maybe all these factors, as I said, come together, and we don't really know where which one ends and where the other begins. But it has happened. And as I believe, once the Nigerians decide that they're going to do something, the rest of Africa responds as its brothers and sisters. So we decided that we were going to tell our stories. We decided that we were going to take the matters into our own hands and engage privately. We decided we were going to ignore the government. And that's exactly what's happened. For better or worse, what we're seeing now is the after effect of just that decision to just be and tell the stories. And I also wanted to just say that charity begins at home. The internationalization or acceptance of what we're doing is so important. It's a wonderful mirror, but the most important thing is the internal mirror. We deciding that this is what we want, this is what we demand, and putting money to it. You know, that sense of Nigerians wanting Nigerian, South Africans wanting South African, and what I hope that these fairs and these kinds of fora will create is us wanting more of each other's expressions, because that's when we really can truly combust as a continent. Economic bloc, creative bloc, and it's not going to happen without those overlaps, but it's there. I see it every day in my Nigerian context, and it's wonderful.
And so obviously there's that creativity, and I know we've discussed before this idea of like the quantity of creative output, and then how do you start discerning the quality and navigating that sort of ecosystem? And I'll put this out to anyone actually about, not the middlemen, but the role of the galleries in the continent. You know, how developed are they? What are their strengths and challenges? I don't know if anyone wants to jump in on that point. Or no one.
I do think that the role of the galleries is crucial, and it's the first front, like for artists to start developing themselves. Working with a gallery is kind of usually the first step, and in Africa, the legacies that there were in a lot of galleries, it's changing now. Obviously, in Nigeria, again, South Africa has always been kind of like a little bit blessed in terms of like the infrastructures and the system that they had here. But in most of the countries, you didn't have that. And you have also no public support from the governments or like the culture. There are different problems. People feel like, as Frank said earlier, most people think like art is not the most important, but it's slightly changing. And I'm seeing as I'm like traveling the continent, or even in my own Congo, Democratic Republic of Congo, we have seen new galleries opening in the last 2 to 3 years. A lot of new galleries opening because they sense that something is happening and that there's a good timing to kind of like start having the voice and start having the visibility. And the more the visibility, the more the demand. So there's a high correlation to that. So it is important to have galleries, but not only. You have to have galleries, museums, which started like here. Again, there's an amazing museum here, but there have been new museums like built in the last few years throughout the continent. Exposure, like exhibition spaces, be it from a gallery or corporations, because as we said, sometimes the private sector has to step in and take the work. And you see in a lot of countries like corporations, banks, and everything having collections and exposing in hotels, in their banks and everything. So all that ecosystem is slowly kind of like taking roots, and I can see that happening in many countries. And I think this is going to be definitely important for the sustainability of the market.
And there's that sort of education that comes with investing and collecting as well. Serge, I don't know, in terms of navigating across the continent, like what artists to invest in, to support, do you think that infrastructure, the galleries are part of it, but there's also fairs and there's a whole range, like a whole professional services around that. Do you think that's quite developed? Do you think it's developing? Obviously, you're playing a role.
Yeah, it's extremely developed. I mean, I think, the amount of information I get on my computer these days, with presentations of artists and exhibitions and art fairs and galleries and biennales, and it's incredible the amount of work we get to see. And I was saying earlier, I think, when I started collecting in Africa, like 12, 13 years ago, I think I would look at 10 artists and I would find 5 of them interesting, and I would probably buy 3 or 4 works by those artists. Today, there's so much production, there's so much art out there that it becomes much more difficult to select. And I think today, I don't know, maybe 1 out of 20 artists I see, I get to buy. And that means that, but all of those artists need representation. They need more galleries. They need more art fairs. And my taste isn't necessarily the right taste. I mean, there are lots of other collectors out there who pick differently. So I think it's developed a lot, and that's fascinating, and that's excellent. Going back to Investec Art Fair, I mean, for me, it's been, I was saying this earlier privately, it's been one of the most incredible places to come. I've discovered amazing artists here when they started, their route. It's one of the only fairs that I come to, and I never regret coming to it, because it really, it's got the best of what's happening on the continent in Africa. I found great artists like Simone Lee here, or, artists who've become major superstars, Portia, who's represented by Stevenson, who's an amazing artist. Lots of, Tsinga Samson, who's at the auction here. There's a beautiful piece at the Strauss auction. Everybody should bid on it. It's not mine. So I think we're very fortunate to be at this point in time. I think one of the questions we all are asking ourselves is what's next for Africa, because obviously what's been driving the growth in the last couple of years is, this figuration, this portraiture, and everybody, I think, feels a bit tired about that. So, we have to see what artists bring out next and what is the next trend. That's the next panel, and I'm curious to see what my colleagues think is coming up next.
No pressure on panel 2.
Yeah.
We'd like that information, please. And I mean, everyone's being very positive, which is lovely, but presumably, obviously, the galleries are developing, we're seeing that infrastructure getting more consolidated, but are there challenges, whether that's logistics, education, the speed of development on the continent versus that sort of international interest? Anyone want to jump in with some negativity?
Look at
Yay.
I mean, I can just comment from, we spoke about it when we had our chat, and it was really that kind of social and economic factor that plays a big role. So what we did at Investec was we actually took all our passion points and we decided that we're going to educate each other on our passion points. So mine being art, someone likes Formula One, someone likes wine, like Frank, those kind of things. And then we just all have a chat, we have lunch together, and we educate each other on it, because we're not all from the same backgrounds, we don't know all the same things. Even with the fair, we're taking our whole team, there's about 15 of us, to walk through the fair on Friday and talk about the artists, educate each other on it. So I think the education piece is a huge role to play, and if you know more about it, you feel more confident about it.
Does that translate to collectors as well? Like the idea of collecting, that it's not just because that is sort of learned. I think we downplay the importance of collecting. It's something you have to learn to do. You need advice, and you need support. How is that in the continent? Is that support and advice there?
Can I say one quick thing? So on that, when I was talking to you again, when I started, I bought what people told me to buy, and then I started again because it didn't work for me. Then I started buying what I loved and started researching it, and I was saying to Serge as well privately, I said I start reading art books now in my private time, and it just becomes a huge passion. And going to galleries can be a little bit intimidating, but it's not as bad as you make it out to be. You walk up to someone, they'll help you, they'll talk to you. You can start on the Artsy platform, you can start online at Strauss, but there's a lot out there and available to you. So it's really just putting that first foot forward for you as a collector.
And at Artsy, you can have your own private advisors as well, recommending you on what would fit your budget and your audience and what specially you are interested in collecting. So I think that's something that is really, really important. And going back to maybe a negative, I mean, that's quite
it doesn't have to be negative.
No,
it's
I think it's like, we have so much on the platform. How can we make sure that every artist is being represented fairly and every gallery? And that's something that we, within my team that I now work in, is passionate about, the visibility across the board, whatever shape or size the gallery is. And that's something I think is really, really important to what we need to do on Artsy.
I just wanted to add, to the challenges. So that's for sure. Africa as a whole has a lot of different challenges, and challenges like, as you said, social, economical, education is a very important thing, but there are sometimes things that other markets would not experience that we have to think about, like just transport, residencies, access to residencies, international residencies. For a lot of the African artists is not always an option. So I think as a whole, as an industry, we have to also think about how do we adapt to the realities of the continent to make it still thrive and grow. And I think education, as we said, is super important, and it goes from the collector side, the market in general, but also just the artists. Not sure why. sometimes the artists also don't have that access that in some markets you take for granted about how do you market yourself, how do you present your work, how do you, like all of those things, you make a catalog, a portfolio, all of those things sometimes we have to teach them. So thinking about how we can accelerate all that is going to be a challenge, but it's also a great opportunity for the market to continue to grow.
I know, you've talked about resilience before. Resourcefulness is something that artists particularly are strong at here.
I think we've done well, sort of as organically as we could on the continent. And I think it's not necessarily negative, but it's just something to be careful about, that we do not try to mimic the West. You know, what Dana said about adapting, we need to be seriously true to who we are and where we are and the challenges, and which is why we will grow where education maybe comes more through the salon, maybe through conversations. I mean, Roland is here. He gave me one of my first tiny books. It's called Confessions of a Poor Collector. And just as Tristan was saying, collecting starts with reading. You know, before you buy a piece of art, you have to sort of decide what you like, who you are. In that journey, you need to study. So I think there's a trap that we could easily fall into because of the shininess and the sex of art, to mimic, very, very, very developed countries, and that would be a mistake. Even the idea of moving on from figuration so quickly. I mean, I've always been an abstract girl, but I understand that even within my collector base, some people are still stuck on seeing very representational art. Some people have moved on. Funds have made these differences. Some people have means now, some people don't. The age bracket of people as well. So there's so many specifics that we must always be very cognizant of, that we don't sort of bunch up movement and allow movement at many, many levels and make it a true movement and a true African movement that mimics us in our diversity. I think that's something that we have to be really careful about, that we don't just try and copy and paste, because they're very, very different realities, and we like that. We want it to be different realities. That's why the world is a diverse place. That's, I think, something I just wanted to say.
And actually, when you talk about mimicking, obviously something, as you've mentioned, in the West, there's this sort of reliance on government funding to some extent for the cultural activity, and it's been mentioned that there's not that sort of central support necessarily for the artist production here. So I'm just thinking in terms of philanthropy and the models that can underpin some of these private initiatives, to what extent there's a need for education around philanthropy and patronage of art. So I don't know if anyone wants to chime in with anything on that.
Welcome to the talk. Come to the talk on Saturday at the Cape Town Art Fair, where I'll be actually speaking about philanthropy and entrepreneurship. And I think that all of us, to an extent, always wear these two hats. I think to be an African collector, an African gallerist, an African artist even, you have to wear these two hats. This is the unique thing about where we're coming from, and educating ourselves on how you can't have one role, but we all have to have these roles until we all get to where we're going to, which hopefully is not a journey that we can see, and continue to pass those torches down. I think they can't exist without each other.
Can I just say something as well? So we actually have a philanthropy division at Investec, where we have a number of clients, high net worth, we look after, and we look after their money and their initiatives. And our CEO, Fani Titi, actually has a saying that we say we live in society, not off society. And so we have all our big clients coming for a breakfast on Friday morning from the philanthropy space at the office, and then we walk them over to the fair, and we try and collaborate the two and see if there is an initiative that can be driven to adapt the two together. So I agree fully with you.
Serge, do you have anything on that?
I don't think I have anything
Oh,
to add.
that's fine.
It's very important.
Yeah.
Of course, try to do my bit.
So, thank you for that. I think I was then going to look at really the sort of pace of the ecosystem's development and within the continent, and how that relates to the pace of the market on an international perspective, that sort of dialogue and relationship between the two, and to what extent the ecosystem can develop in the continent quickly enough to ensure that prices, for example, on the international level, aren't preventing work from staying or being absorbed here also. So I wondered if anyone had any thoughts on to what extent that pace is matched at the moment, or whether there's any risk around that. Looking interesting. Yeah.
Can you hear me? Yes. No, I don't think the pace is matched completely. Obviously, again, Africa doesn't always have the technologies and the infrastructure to match what is happening in the West. And that's something that we have to be mindful of, because sometimes what happens still today is the fact that an artist would start doing well or started locally and then goes internationally and it explodes, but then is not competitive in the market locally anymore. Nobody in Africa can afford him anymore, and that's a problem because it contributes to that idea that art is made for the West, and it even influences artists to work so that it matches the taste of the West and all those things. So we have to be conscious of that, and we have to work on that to help the local market develop a little bit faster. But also, I think there are some factors that are gonna work in our favor, in just the fact that, like, obviously we all know the market has been booming in the past few years, and a lot of people with the crisis, the financial crisis that might be looming, or the recession, people are wondering if it's gonna slow down and everything. I don't think it will slow down, but it might just be a little bit more reasonable in a way. And that's a good thing, because then we can start maybe growing and thinking about it in a more constructive and sustainable way versus like a speculative, being in a speculative space.
And sustainable, like how do we sustain this? Does anyone else have any comments on that, how we keep this development sustainable and long-lasting?
I think, since we're speaking about markets, and we're here at Strauss, and I don't want to ruffle any feathers, and I doubt that they're guilty of this, but I think there's a very big responsibility of the platforms that sell to check and guide on hyper pricing. I have seen directly scenarios of an artist, maybe 3-4 years out of school, did the crossover quickly, straight to Europe auction house. Some wonderful backers who think they're helping this artist. A charged demand, and then we see record pricing. And then we see record pricing again. And then last year, we saw a drop. Then we saw a drop, and we saw a drop. Now, I think that if we remember the original reasons for art in the first place, this sort of irresponsible hyping should be checked. And there are many ways to check that, because these ideas go into an auction, someone says yes, someone allows that to happen. Who loses in the end? The artist is likely destroyed, as well as the people who were, I guess, influenced enough to go for that art at that price. So when we are now looking at what is sustainable, that doesn't fall in. It also then sends a very strange signal to the artists who are going through the motions, the collectors who are going through the motions, the spaces that are going through the motions, nicely progressing, maybe not hyper progressing, and then those ones look slow. And then you talk about things like pace. What pace? The pace should be based on demand and reality and reasonability and sustainability. That's the pace. Of course, there'll be anomalies, but if you end up on the wrong side of those anomalies, you can be very, very bitter and leave the art space altogether. You're distrusting. You no longer trust the gallery. You don't trust the artist. And I think there should be a self-regulation. We're a very unregulated space, I think, across the world, but I think there's an onus on the individual to self-regulate, whether you're the booker in the auction house, whether you're the gallerist who's trying to quickly cash out, whether you're even the artist who has this really, really lofty ideas of what you think your art is worth, to think about the entire ecosystem.
There we go.
And yes, I think that there has to be some sense of that regulation and responsibility and care for the entire system.
And actually, Rose, obviously we're talking about platforms, not to put all the responsibility on you. I like that one.
I think at Artsy we have dedicated teams based on if something's being listed well over what we've seen the trend of on the market, we will contact that gallery and then make sure that they're being realistic, as well as with all our auction partners as well. We also, around the education that we have, whether it's our editorial articles, it's the benefit auctions we're working with more emerging artists from the continent. It's something that we're very careful working with the gallery or the artist at pricing their works at a price that works for them based on where they are in their career progression as well. So yeah, it's a very hot topic internally, and we are making sure that we can be as diplomatic, probably that's the wrong word, but just much more fair to the market.
Serge.
Yeah, I just want to talk about sustainability. I think, the key to sustaining a growing market is to bring in more clients. We all know that. And I think, going back to what Strauss is doing here with this new curatorial voices auction, I think that's a great initiative, because, that's why we're all, participating and, supporting and bringing artists. And it hopefully, Strauss, it has probably the largest collector base of modern African art. They've been around the longest. They're the biggest auction house, and everybody knows Strauss, and everybody's on their mailing list in Africa. I think part of our role, or my role, in participating with Strauss is taking what Strauss has to offer, and maybe, through my social media activity, through the people that follow me, maybe open up to more audiences around the world. And on the other hand, I'm also bringing back work to Africa, because my hope is that it gets collected by Africans, by new collectors in Africa. And expanding into contemporary art with the biggest auction house in Africa, I think, is critical to adding more collectors. So, even if this auction results in, 2 new buyers of contemporary art who weren't buying contemporary art before, I think we did a wonderful thing.
Brilliant. Okay, so looking forward, because everyone needs to know what's next by the end of today. That's our role. Let's go back to, I've flown in from London. There's a lot of discussion where we are about the future of the art market over the next couple of years, a lot of concerns, unsurprisingly, about the health of the art market. There has been a growth in high net worth individuals across Africa, but it was hit by the pandemic. There was a bit of a drop. How are we feeling, I guess, about wealth levels and that, how that's going to translate to the market? Tristan, I'm going to start with you here.
Sure. So I think my view is that there's just been a shift of wealth. I know you sent me a report and you said there's been a decline of wealth, but from a perspective, I work in the investment management space, we're just seeing an outflow of cash from sort of emerging markets to developed markets at the moment. I think it's more of a safety net. I don't want to use that word, it's a horrible word. But I think when I looked at the auctions and the recent results, I mean, Strauss has done a phenomenal job. Their results are phenomenal. The sales are phenomenal. I think where there's a willing seller, there's a willing buyer. And I think you've seen people immigrating. You've seen people recheck their collections if they've got too many works. Maybe you've outgrown a few things. Maybe some things have become more valuable than you thought. So people just reshifting, I think. And I think from the sales results, you're seeing there is this young collective coming through, maybe like Serge indicated. I think it's just a change in buyers, and I think it's a good thing. I'm quite positive about it because I'm seeing from fair numbers growing, foot traffic growing. I think we've got a long way to go still. And I think everyone keeps saying 4 more years, then this trend is shifting to Latin America. I don't think so. I think it's here to stay.
And also, it's one that's been here for a while. I think we're just obviously talking about some record figures recently, but this has been a long-coming development. So, as you say, it's not overnight. So.
No, and I think it is just that shift in wealth. And I mean, like you were saying, it could be an Africa shift as well. So I don't know where it's coming from. Maybe Strauss can tell you, but...
Can't see anyone from Strauss. They've all run away, so... Rose.
And when we have definitely a younger collector base at Artsy that might be traditionally too scared to walk into a gallery, so it's them coming onto the platform and guiding to them what fits their budget. And I don't think we've seen a decline in the amount of money that they're spending. It's more about, as you said, it's around the shift. And what they are looking for to buy, whether it's, it's not going to be the blue chip artist now, it's going to be more conscious investments. That's what we're seeing.
And I mean, prices are still accessible across quite a lot of these markets. So this shift towards younger buyers, that again has been happening across the art market in quite a few different pockets. As I said, do you think that is because of the accessibility of the price? Do you think it's the shifting wealth? What is it, do you think, why is this collector base developing and broadening in this way and having this particular growth in younger collectors?
I hate to say tech, we've seen all those the big techs have made a lot of redundancies, but I think the big tech is more accessible for the young, making more money quickly, and tech is something I think we definitely have as a US company on the platform, which...
Yeah.
To that.
Yeah, of course.
Definitely. In the Nigeria case, I think that the new collectors have come from innovation businesses, farm tech, financed. It's just been very interesting to see new money. But there was a lull, and that lull was because, of course, younger people felt intimidated to come into spaces. Art has, for whatever reason, received its reputation as this elitist space, which drives me nuts. I'm like, please come in. You don't have to buy anything, just come and see.
Good to know that's global.
But it's always a struggle as a gallerist to get people to feel comfortable to come in and share space, because I feel like you must see and learn and love first before you buy. Maybe today is a view and tomorrow is a buy. And so what has happened with these younger collectors in the Nigeria space in particular is that there's new money, and then with social media, that sort of became really the language during COVID. There was now more ability to have conversations, lots of WhatsApp groups forming. I've managed to find myself in quite a few strange WhatsApp groups where I am the most knowledgeable. But what is great, and as I said, the onus is on everybody to do your part. So I will end up in a group with maybe people in their 20s and 30s, and there's like me, and they're like, wow, she's here. And then you immediately break the ice to let everyone know that no one knows anything. We're all learning. And once the curiosity begins, they become comfortable, and then they start thinking about this asset that the 60-year-olds and the 70-year-olds and the 50-year-olds have been insane about for decades. They're also hearing these numbers. Of course, everyone likes numbers. I think it's tricky with numbers because sometimes they're very good and sexy, but those two factors just have made this new crop of collectors come up. The negative is that the language of art as an investment has become a really, really popular one on the West African continent. I don't know about in South Africa. But again, I think it's not a challenge, it's an opportunity wherever we find ourselves to add to the narrative and educate those so they don't just go down the road of art collecting for investment's sake. It's wonderful if you end up buying something you love that does hold value, but the narrative of go down this road because it's an investment is a really, really popular one.
Is it dominant here? Because
it's dominant in Nigeria for sure.
Interesting.
But then, of course, it's also dominant to have, educators. We also have a very nice balancing educational side that lets you know. And of course, the old collectors also play that role, because the old collectors will tell them, it took me 30 years to amass this wealth. It took me this long to pay for my first piece. And so once that conversation is happening and those two classes are speaking to each other, then we're moving. Because that hype is wonderful and it's nice for the temporary, but it's not great for the long term.
I mean, it's hard because obviously I write about markets, the art market, so obviously I'm very used to the narrative around art as an investment, but I guess we're looking at a whole ecosystem here. We're trying to understand what role the education institutions are playing, museums. So it'd just be interesting really to understand your thoughts, as you say, around that balance between the narrative of art as an investment or art for all these other its other qualities. So as a society across the continent, how that balance is playing out. I don't know if anyone has any thoughts on that. Or we all just think it's a great investment. Yep, that one's... Yep.
just what Agoma said earlier about these groups, and I think the youth are taking this ecosystem into their own hands, because I ended up on some group called Young Collectors Guild, and I'm not very far from young, but it's so interesting what they do. They just share the catalogues that are released by the fair, by the galleries, and then they all comment on it. What do you think of it? Is it nice? And it's not just Africa, SA based, it also becomes an international flair. And there's about 60 or 70 people on the group, and I just stay on it to watch what they're all up to, and it's just so intriguing.
I think we should do a panel on WhatsApp groups by the sounds of it. What are the sort of dominant WhatsApp groups for collecting?
They're really powerful. Lots of work come to me, and they're sharing information, and so there's a lot of curiosity, and we can't ignore it. I think we all need to participate where we can. And just to answer your question before, I'm not saying it's one or the other. I'm saying yes, for investment, for knowledge, for love, for community. These things can all coexist, and they can grow culturally. They can grow financial truths for all of us. I don't even doubt that art has made me money, but I never went into collecting for that. But everyone will have a rainy day where they need to liquidate something. Yep. And it's again these ecosystems that allow the market to be real, where I enter at A and I can exit at B. It's because of the work of the auctions, it's because of the work of the galleries, it's because of the work of the fairs, the entire system that allows a market to exist. And the market must be sustained, because we all need to survive based on economies. It would be a very big shame if we just had the most beautiful art but no economies to back them. And what we're trying to achieve is both, and it's very, very feasible. And I think we're seeing that happen right before our eyes. So we're kind of all in a historical time, I think, a new renaissance, I like to call it.
That's a positive point to end, actually. And I think we've just about got some time for some questions. Oh, does anyone else want to add anything before? Sorry. Serge, please.
I just want to say, I don't know if people know about my background a little bit, but I was in wealth management for 10 years, working for Citigroup across Europe and the Middle East. And I was an art collector at the same time, and I left banking in 2007 because I realized that so many of these wealthy clients whose money I was managing, they liked the art, but they never understood it as an investment. And they never sort of considered it because the bank wasn't educating them about, the statistical benefit of owning art in your portfolio. When you're looking at, global wealth management, you have to consider, for many families, art is a major asset, and for others, it isn't at all, and it should be. It should be in every portfolio. And one of the reasons I left banking was in order to found a fund to invest in contemporary art from developing markets and approach it through the investment angle and actually turn financial investors into collectors at the end of the day. And I was very successful at doing that, and I think that's a model that I would hope that financial institutions pick up on, because that investment angle is one of the angles through which you create the sustainability we were talking about, and by bringing in new collectors and new capital into the art ecosystem.
Were they quite receptive, that process, or was it a bit of a struggle to start with?
No, I think they were receptive. I mean, it was mostly people I knew and trusted me who invested. I was trying to get the bank to partner with me and distribute it more broadly. It was difficult. It was early days, where I'm talking 12 years ago. So we've moved a long way since then. But the people who did participate really enjoyed it. They got to borrow the works that we had in the fund and hang them in their home or hang them in their office. When they wanted to realize their investment, they could choose to realize it in cash or in artwork. And several chose artworks because they fell in love with them. They got information about them, they got educated, and they've become collectors. They came in as financial investors, they left as collectors. And that's fantastic. So, I think the financial organizations can do more to use that narrative about art as an investment to bring in more collectors, nurture passion. And it actually has a lot of benefits for families who collect together. There's families who do golf trips around the world, and there's families who do art trips around the world, and that's what binds them together. So there's a lot of additional benefits that are not just economical.
I think everyone agrees on that one by the sounds of it. Interesting, yeah. If you have a mic. It's like pass the mic.
Okay, there we go. So within our space, I can only talk around that. I mean, I look at international fairs, they're all sponsored by big banks now. So it shows you there is that commitment, I think, coming through from the financial world. I think we do call it a diversification in your portfolio, so there is an element of that. We just hit a few headwinds in terms of how you advise and how you set up the fund, so maybe you can help us with that. And I had a query earlier from one of our colleagues or clients in the audience here who said, could we lend against artworks? And I know that's something we are looking at. So it is becoming a more adaptive space. In terms of our own collection, we, as Investec, are busy moving to a new building and we are building a new collection. So I think it is definitely a very important element that corporate does own their own collections because it is a commitment to that space and to the younger artists. And the mandate we got is to buy young artists. So we are working around that.
Brilliant. Right, so I think we've got some time for questions. Not loads, but a little bit of time. So I don't know if anyone wants to, if we could get a mic out as well to someone. Oh, we have one on standby. Does anyone have any questions in the audience? No one. Everyone's eager to, yes. Oh, just get the mic. Oh, here we go. Sorry, Kate.
Thank you. Hi. I really wanted to speak about the new collector. I know you're speaking about your private wealth clients diversifying their assets. I know that South Africa is a country that's possibly having a brain as well as a financial drain, and I think Investec's probably one of those companies that feels it. I'm Jewish. I know that there's like a major exodus going on at the moment, and I just want to know how you actually want to plan on speaking to the new collector, who might not be young Jewish professionals or the children of young Jewish professionals.
Microphone. So, I mean, for young people, maybe not from a Jewish background, so obviously our business is multicultural, it's not necessarily Jewish. But we did a collaboration with Strauss not so long ago with a young entrepreneurs base, which is your newly qualified CAs, your newly qualified lawyers, taking them literally from any university in the country. They want to bank with us. We've got certain criteria that we do onboard them. And we did a collaboration with Frank where we said there's this hunger to learn. And we brought them to the last auction, I think it was in November last year sometime. And we got Frank just to talk about how he collects, what artists you look for, why you look for these artists, who they are. And we walked around the space. And I promise you, these people were so hungry for information. We're actually looking at doing it again because it really is a space we need to educate and entertain a bit more.
Cool. Do you think that it's the young CAs that you should actually be speaking to? Because there are a lot of people that are actually coming through different parts of society, actually really starting to come into a lot of money that you might need to be appealing to. It's not really just your CAs or your general like kind of wealth clients that you would have taken in the past. And I don't know whether it's like indicative of what's actually happening in the art world or in Africa, but there seems to be a new kind of buyer. I mean, I don't know, I walked around the last big banking art fair in Joburg, I don't have to mention names, but it didn't seem like there were really buyers there.
Yeah.
And it kind of seems like a stale crowd, and sorry, I'm kind of coming into it and I'm just going to speak my mind. But I think that there has to be a new sort of appeal, and I'd hate to be the guy to say it, but I'm just kind of walking into a room as a kind of outsider, and it's just you can see like the general art crew. I did fine art, so I mean I might have gone into it if I was really interested in like staying in the exhibition space. But I think that there's, especially in South Africa, a whole new type of buyer that's not actually being spoken to. I think maybe it's more possibly on the decentralized platforms, which is not really considered as art at the moment. But there are people out there who are not completely elitist, but they want beautiful things that they can own, brag about, enjoy, and keep in their spaces. And I think that that really needs to be taken into account.
So you're 100% correct. I think our space would be entertaining our clients and our focus, but then the philanthropy piece comes in where we focus on a broader space. And for me, that's what the fair does. The fair is an open platform for anyone to buy a ticket, come anytime you want, walk around at your own pace. We also give a handful of tickets over to schools for education purposes if the art class wants to come. So I definitely feel you're 100% on target. We do need to have a broader reach, but it needs to be a handful of people, more than a handful of people doing it. It needs to have that extensive...
And hopefully the digital platforms are going to open that up. But I think we've got another question.
I just wanted
sorry.
to... I agree with you as well. There is like a big group of people, and I sense it, like young people, a lot of people that are interested in art, because we all know like wealth in Africa has been growing for the past couple of decades and is expected to continue to grow. So how do we attract those people? And I think, yes, there's this preconception that Ugama was speaking earlier, that it's elitist, it's a little stiff and all those things. So how do we speak a language? And I'm not from the art background, so I'm also like worked in finance, in tech and everything, but that's also kind of what I started, like the online platform. I think tech and the digital world offer great opportunities to speak a different language, to speak to a bigger crowd, to attract people that feel intimidated by the artwork. They're like traditional sort of artwork, and it's a work that all of us, I think, are trying to do at the same time in different ways. But yes, there is like a big audience, and that's why I think we're all bullish about the prospect of the market.
You've destroyed the mic. I think he's giving a message to all the fairs. He's basically telling all the fairs to be more intentional about its curation of its art as well as its guests. And I think that, let's speak like we're all under one big tree as Africans. We need to be responsible that we also are not guilty of the pretension and exclusion, because even when a fair wants to be inclusive, the guests can also be exclusive. You know, sometimes even a guest or group of guests can ruin the experience. And I think what I hear him saying is that we all need to hold each other accountable, whatever part of the ecosystem you're playing in, to really grow. Because you honestly don't know if that guy has $2 million to spend. And he shouldn't have to tell you he has $2 million to spend for you to include him or her or it, right? And I think that's what I hear you saying. And I think that even in spite of the record sales that we're seeing in all our commercial platforms, there needs to also be sort of this continued look at who's here. Is this diverse? Is this really, really diverse? Even when it's not broken, because we're still in a nascent stage of our growth, we need to still look and really, truly diversify all the crowds, whether it's the receiver side, the maker side, and even the intermediary side.
And that's a challenge for the whole art world globally.
I think it's the whole art world. It's not just the South African fairs, it's the Nigerian fairs as well. And this is feedback I'll take home particularly.
May I just ask a question? I'm Guido Giachetti, I'm a collector. I'm a little aged, but I think like everything, it's a question of education. Young ones have to be educated, but they have to educate themselves. If you go to a bank and you're trying to buy an assets class, anyone, you'll have the success stories, you'll have the less success stories. And if you're not educated, if your banker doesn't tell you what the risks are, you won't do the right choice, or you would just not know what you're doing. And I think the whole ecosystem here, and we've heard it in different platforms, through the artsy, through banks, through everybody, the collectors themselves. It's a question of education, and it is left upon the new collector, the interested party, to actually educate himself. We can't do that for him or her. They have to take responsibility of their own. So my advice is, if you are a collector by passion, because you want, then buy what you really like, which is going back to Tristan. And then you educate yourself and you grow your base. If you are doing it for an investment, then go to an advisor and trust your advisor, or not. Change advisor if you don't trust them. So it's a question of education and knowing that there is a lot of risks, because we see African art going up and then down the next year. But if you look at the trend over years, the actual average of trend is 14 years. An artist is, in average, up on the market for 14 years, and then it collapses. So when are you going to sell that piece, or are you going to keep it forever? And that's really up to your risk appetite and what you want to do. So every research says, you know, there's risk like in any other investments, and it's not just going up all the time.
And I think we'll be looking at that a bit in the next panel as well, certainly looking at those trends and what risks are around that. I think we have another question. Here we go. I don't think there was a question.
Thank you, everybody. It's been so interesting. I'm a researcher at Strauss, and I sort of, listening to all of you talk about African art as a trend or just recently, and I particularly think to Nigeria in particular as a country extremely diverse in creativity and very big, but a long history, actually, a long, deep history of creativity and creative making, and a lot of figuration, actually, if you think about it. And I just wanted to talk to something that I feel we have a responsibility as art practitioners to pay attention to, and it's part of education. If we want people to love art like we do and to invest in artists like we have and build this economy, we have to look to supporting the institutions that make it publicly accessible. And one of the biggest risks and a scary thing, I think, that is across the whole continent, and it exists whether it's South Africa, Nigeria, DRC, is the neglect to the museums and public institutions and the lack of support from art practitioners like ourselves, because we can't rely on the government like in other areas of the world. So I wanted to just hear from anyone who wanted to put in what you think we could do to resolve this, because we need children in museums from young till now, and to fall in love and to invest in our creative culture. Oh, thanks. I don't know what your thoughts are there.
Anyone want to fight for the young in museums? Here we go.
Thank you.
Hello.
Thank you. Thank you for talking about the long history. On our call, when we're preparing for this panel, when we talk about the resurgence and what's going on now, I mentioned, and we have this chat, that in the case of Nigeria, and I'm sure in the case of South Africa as well, but definitely for Nigeria, I always cringe a little bit because there's nothing new. In 1977, the world gathered in Nigeria because creativity and creative expression and output was not new. The entire world came. The entire black world and white world came to Nigeria. In 1961, Leopold Senghor addressed people in Paris to talk about Africa and its resurgence at that time. So, this train has been going on for a long time. The need for museums, yes, is key. The design of those museums, very, very important, because the museum in Paris must not resemble the museum in Lagos, must not resemble the museum in Cape Town or wherever. And I think that just like the Zeitz-Mocha, we will have to create interesting partnerships to create museums out of dead infrastructure. It will be led by the private sector, and that's not a problem. The developed world also in art was led by the private sector. Private individuals were collectors and decided to do institutions. So even in America and in England, again, the power of the individual. And it's again just to remember that we have responsibility as agents, individuals, to decide this is what we want and this is where we want to put our money. I can speak that to my own investment, partnering with schools. I'm starting a foundation, and one of the things we're going to do is essentially regenerate the schools, the departments. In Nigeria, in the 60s, people came to study in Nigeria. We We had great schools. We don't anymore. People like, actually, who was it? Sokoto and Benin became friends because they came from South Africa and Nigeria and met in Paris, but could relate because they've been educated excellently. These people thrived outside of Africa because they were excellently educated. So our schools, I think, as you speak about public institutions, need to start first. I think the education at that level is what could then inspire parents to start to even think that their children should spend a Sunday or Saturday at a museum. I don't think that we should force museums in the traditional space, a traditional style that the West has been accustomed to on us now. But we will and we should, and we must create quasi-museums. I call it quasi-museums because each person who's a collector has a home. Each office that has a collection is a space. Open these spaces up, and already you have the museum behavior. If you want to share art for free, let us open the spaces where the art lives in currently before we wait for some massive $2 billion infrastructure to be built, which will be built, and it's happening in Nigeria now. But we can't wait 15 years for the kids to see art and understand that mommy and daddy are not really crazy. They're just in love, and they're in love with this piece because of this and this and this and this and this. So I think that, again, just to my other point about us being customized in our thinking and thinking about what works for us as a group, as a people, is key. But the schools need to be rejuvenated, and I think every collector has a chance to be a martyr and become a real patron by looking at the schools in your area and thinking, what can I do? What books can I buy for the library? What can I do in the places where this thing is being created? Because without that, we're really just not moving.
And there is a strong track record of artists opening up residencies and spaces and libraries. I don't know if anyone wants to add anything before we probably have to go for our break, but Dana.
To add to it, I think it's also very important that contemporary African art is replaced within its context. It's not something new, as you said, in Nigeria, in South Africa, in the DRC, in most countries, actually. When you go, they all have a history of modern art that came before it. And I think the focus has been placed also so much on contemporary art that we sometimes forget about talking about the modern art and what is the history that comes with it and the context, geopolitical, historical, all of this, because this has impacted and is still impacting the work of artists today. And I think that, yes, as an industry, we have to be able to tell that story a little bit better, to put it more forefront. And I think in terms of when it comes to museums and institutions, maybe some of them might be a little bit also timid into going into the whole contemporary thing because there's no context before. So maybe let's bring that forward. And I know Strauss & Co. has been amazing in doing that for the Southern African part. But it would be interesting to expand it to the rest of Africa, because I know from seeing it, from traveling, there are great older stories to be told in Nigeria, in Kenya, in Ethiopia, in Senegal, all of those countries. And that's true that I agree that we should bring it forward a little bit more.
I'd like to add that, I think in many ways for me, museums have failed to meet up to my expectation of them. I think very well-funded museums in the West for decades, forgot about black art, forgot about female artists, forgot about queer artists. They're consensus-driven. They're very analytical. They don't experiment. They play a very important role in being open to the public and on an educational level. But I think you need, I completely agree with Goma and what's been said here. I think you need a lot more access to, individuals who take bigger risks. We have Louis Norval here. That's amazing. These private institutions can really sort of open up the dialogue. And I don't think there's, we know that government is not very efficient at running anything. So even on the economic front, leaving in these creating government institutions that are supposed to set the tone for what's happening culturally is a failed attempt to start off with. So, yes, they're very important to have, but I think, you know, more and more, and we're seeing this both in the market point of view and even in the sort of public arena, it's private initiative that's taking over. And I don't think that's going to stop. It's just going to continue.
Thank you. Right, I think we are out of time, but thank you to our panelists so much. It was really interesting. I think I'm confidently meant to announce some sort of refreshments. I can see something in the corner if everyone wants to help themselves. I think we've got a bit of a break. And we're meeting back in about 20 minutes, is that right? Yeah, about 20 minutes.
so much. That was a fantastic first panel, Ria. Thank you so much. And thank you all for staying and for joining for our second talk, which is entitled Trends in Collecting African Art and What's Next for Contemporary. I will let Ria Pryor introduce the guests, and please enjoy.
Hello. So if everyone can take a seat. I feel like a teacher saying that. I'll stop saying that. So for this panel, we're going to explore a little bit more, I guess, some of the terms that we picked up on the first panel, particularly around the term trends and this idea that there's a trend in collecting art from Africa, and also take a look at what we think is next for this market. So we have another wonderful panel. To my left, I have Kensani Makari from Latitudes, curator, but he does many other things. We also have Joost Bosland, director at Stevenson. To my right, I have Louis Norval. I have Aba El Khayal. Oh, I didn't actually introduce you properly, did I? Louis Norval, who's the founder of Norval Foundation. Apologies. And then we have Aba El Khayal, art historian, and also one of the guest collaborators at the show we have just outside, the Curatorial Voice. And then we have Chris Soul, who's an artist based in Cape Town. So welcome, everybody. We're going to kick off actually just examining the subject of this panel itself, so whether we are actually seeing a trend in the sale and the market for art from Africa and its diaspora. Joost rightly challenged me immediately when I started talking on our pre-conference call about to what extent there are a few figures being bandied around and journalists obviously writing up the idea that there's this trend, and to what extent that is a perception or how deep that trend is. So I'm actually going to hand over straight over to Joost, if that's okay, to challenge that claim, I guess.
Thank you for...
Oh, if the microphone works.
Yes, there we go.
Yes.
Fantastic. I just asked the question, to what extent is there really this massive rise that we're reading about? I think quite a lot of the media covering this space are quite lazy and rely on auction house press releases and art fair press releases, which are all self-fulfilling products. Like these press releases need every event to sound like this massive success. So if you're going to read the Strauss press releases and the Cape Town Art Fair press releases, it's going to be like the best week in the history of the art market in Cape Town ever. That's not the case. And for every artist who's making record numbers at auction, there's a really important, probably more important artist in art history who is not being collected in depth. Mm-hmm. So all I'm saying is that the category as a whole isn't thriving. There's pockets within the category that are thriving, and many artists are benefiting from that, and that's amazing. But it's lazy to say African art is new big thing. The other thing I point out is it was a very low baseline, right? When we were starting 15 years ago, there was very little. So 600% increase sounds amazing until you look at where we were at the start of that increase.
That makes sense. I mean, I'd just like to add, not all journalists are lazy. Some of us are very, very keen to look beneath the figures. And Kensani, we actually spoke a bit as well when you're talking about sort of trends, the sort of type of artist styles, and you had some thoughts around that and this sort of notion of trends.
I made a list.
Uh-oh.
Because I'm nervous. But it's all right. I think right now there's a lot of epistemic instability in the world. Like, a lot of people don't know what truth is and don't know what lies are. You know, we're in the era of the deep fake, you know, where people can rip a face and simulate your voice and make you do things that you've never done before. And I think that in the current zeitgeist, that's an energy that permeates most spaces, especially artistic spaces. So for me, the shift that I've seen, or the shift that is emerging, is this shift to a new contemporary abstraction, you know? Because if you can't tell what's true and what's not, you know, you look for something in the middle, you know? And you see that even in the artists we sent out to the Venice Biennale, or Bonolo Kavula, who won the Nobel Art Prize. you know. So a lot of what I've been seeing is that it's sort of like this. Oh, Chris also, you know, it's sort of like these works that are open to interpretation that don't tell you what to think. You know, I think that's what I see emerging, or co-emergent with the portraiture a couple of years.
Yeah, and I think in the next question we look a little bit about areas in the market or markets where we do think there has been some acceleration. But from this side of the panel, because we're split in two, Louis, I guess from your perspective over, say, the last 5 years, have you seen an acceleration? Are you comfortable with the idea that there's a certain trend, as it were, towards collecting and exploring African art?
Yes, I've certainly seen...
oh, is there a mic? Sorry, that was my fault.
Hello? Yeah. I certainly have seen a major shift. I think the event of COVID has, you know, made a big difference where people started buying online. Online's become acceptable. If you, pre-COVID, nobody bought any work of significance without factually seeing it and being there, whereas now you get works, you know, for tens of millions of dollars being sold sometimes without somebody seeing it. But also, if I went back 5 years and more, there was a big drive to start collecting African art, and virtually anything went. So anything that came out of Africa was supposedly something great. But I think the moves now come where we've moved to quality. I think there's a much greater drive on quality. And what is quality? And I think that's part of education. So we need to, we're seeing a much greater drive where people are being educated, and we can maybe touch on that a bit later. But I really see that quality of art is starting to really rise, where it's not all art, and in fact art that is not of the same quality is probably dropping in art. So it's no longer just anything from Africa is good. And I think the other important thing that we're seeing is that previously African art was very localized in some centers in Africa. But there are 54 countries in Africa, and for instance with the African Art Prize that we've launched, we're very focused on having representation across Africa, not only in the centers, and hopefully in the years to come, out of the 54, we'll get a much greater representation from different countries. And we need nominators, you know, and the infrastructure to nominate those works, otherwise it won't happen. So, you know, from my perspective, I think Africa is becoming more important for quality investors who want to buy quality art, and no longer just sort of this African porn art where, you know, anything that comes out and anybody can draw an African face, you know, that's African art. I think we've moved beyond that. We've actually now competing on a global scale, which I think is fantastic because we have phenomenal artists, and I think we're going to develop some really great artists over time. I think the internet, though, has played an enormous part in helping us because we are remote. But everybody doesn't get here. So, you know, yeah, I've seen a major drive, and I'm quite excited because I think we're now going to really but something hopefully we may touch on, we've touched on in the previous program. We need to educate people about art. You know, I take myself, when I started as an investor, you buy art that you like, and maybe it's pretty and it's vogue to buy it. And fortunately, you know, with the people I'm working in the organization and in the art world, I've been educated and understand a bit more what's really good art and what constitutes good art and what makes art history, etc. And once you start understanding that, you then start understanding what art maybe in future, if you're an investor, may enhance yields, why would, and why it's happening. Whereas if you just walk into, into the auction here, there's a lot of work that's pretty, but doesn't mean it's good art. And starting at schools, and but maybe we can touch on that a bit later.
Yeah, and I think, you picked up on the show here, obviously, and tomorrow I'm sure a lot of us will be at the fair, which is organised, it's 10 years now, organised by Ferrero Milano, and even if you look at the editorial and the sort of curatorial framework for this show and the fair, there's so much depth of curatorial thought and analysis going in there. It's not just a sale. It's not presented as a sale, either here or at the fair. So I think that's really developed. And Eva, I know you've been looking at the sort of Egyptian side of things and how that gets into this sort of broader dialogue around African art and how that's developed.
I think for Egypt and for Egyptian artists and myself as a curator, Egypt being both a North African country, but also a country that's categorized and seen as a Middle Eastern country, being at this intersection of two different identities, I think Egyptian artists have really given thought to what it means to be African, and not to fall under the cliche and refer back to Pan-Africanism of the 50s and the 60s, but it is still something very much in the psyche of Egyptians, something that Egyptians give thought to, something that we are sort of returning to for many reasons, political and social. And I think that the aesthetics of what that is also comes into it. And at the moment, I work with a lot of artists that are trying to identify a new aesthetic that's really in line with a more Egyptian sort of identity to art. And I think that's something that Egyptian artists and art history has been sort of moving towards and developing over the past 60 years. And to see that now coming together in contemporary art is really incredible, because they're really pushing away from what is seen in the West and really looking inwards and developing a local vernacular style and referencing vernacular history, and all of that is coming together. But then the question becomes, well, who is this for? I think Egyptian artists are beginning to really produce art for themselves and for a local collecting base, which has become really exciting because collecting has grown and developed in the Middle East, and Egyptians are collecting Egyptian art, which is a bit of a novelty now, because in the past they were collecting prints of Western art. I mean, literally lovely reproduced prints and reproduced paintings of Velázquez, Monet. I mean, there was no reason to hang these paintings at homes, but people did, and they collected furniture. They didn't collect local art, and now that's happening. So all of that is pushing artists to look at their neighbors, and by their neighbors I mean other African artists and African art movements, and trying to engage in this dialogue. And so it's been a really exciting time in Egypt, because there is this idea that we don't necessarily need to look to the West. Let's look inwards and let's look next to us. And I think that things are really moving in an interesting direction in Egypt because of that.
And I think your point there about who is this art being made for, I think, Chris, useful point for you to be introduced. But in terms of, you're not speaking for all artists here, but this idea that there's this, not pressure, but this awareness of this growing interest in art from this continent. Does that have an impact on, not how you work, but your thinking, like how art is being produced?
I'm not sure actually how to answer that question, but I think, oh, sorry, that's very loud.
With an echo, that's how you're going to answer it.
Yeah. Drowning out the booze. I think actually there's been a couple of interesting points that have been made, but Heba's points about sort of Egyptians making art for Egyptians, drawing on what's happening in the local art scene, I think is something that I feel like is happening more here. And what I like about what's happening in the museums locally, I know that the previous talk had, like a comment about the sort of dearth of museums and the lack of institutional support. But I think what's interesting is there is a focus on previous generations of artists whose work has not been highlighted to the extent it should be. So, for me to sort of like look back at someone like Esrom Lachai, who, I'm becoming more and more aware about. There was a show at Norville, there's now like a focus on his work here, and obviously there's many like academic texts and books that have been published, many actually before my time. But to see like forms or like even like certain like considerations present there creates like a sense of like a community, like a shared kind of consideration about the world. I think so locally it's helpful for an artist to find like points of reference for their work, and I think every artist is trying to develop a language or a voice or a means of expressing themselves. And when they see that like echoed in the work of other people, I think it reinforces one's own resolve. And internationally, to travel with your work and then see it received, and to be like fortunate enough to see it received positively is an enormous encouragement. And as you travel, you realize that each country, each little ecosystem within that country even has multiple points of reference for people there reading your work. So, for me to take my work to Italy and realize that like someone like Alberto Burri has explored the same ideas as me, or someone like, Giuseppe Pennone kind of has this like relationship to nature, kind of also allows me to like connect my work into different areas. And I think for every artist, that's a privilege. So maybe it's also for artists about like, and this is, I guess, the role of the gallery, is finding the language within which to position the work of each artist, so that they form part of something as opposed to like an isolated, incidence.
Yeah, that makes sense. And we sort of challenge a little bit this idea of whether it's trend, there's areas of interest. If we could just throw it open a bit, where are we seeing particular areas of interest or sort of accelerated growth within the market, whether that's a type of art, whether that's geography? Does anyone want to chime in with any sort of trends, if we want to use that word? Yes, Eva.
I want to bring up figuration, just because we had been speaking about it earlier.
We've heard it quite a lot already. Let's throw it in, yeah.
And I know it seems to be like the big bad genre now that everyone's working on and people are a little bit tired of. But, I think that there's something to be said for trends that seem to consume us in the art world for a few years, that we as art world practitioners and curators and artists might get a little bored of. But the truth of the matter is that what we do, what we produce, what we present, takes quite a few years to be digested and to sort of trickle down to a wider audience. And so even though we, some of us might say that we want figuration to sort of move on and let's look to the next thing that's going to be exciting, I think that yes, trends do drive a lot of the things that we see in the art world, and it seems like a trend, but really it's a large conversation that takes place not just amongst us as art world practitioners, but with the public. And the public needs a while to catch up with that dialogue. And so, to talk about trends, I think, in terms of sales, in terms of maybe some of the museum exhibitions, I think it's a bit short-sighted, because I think that things take, and deservedly so, should spend time in the minds and imaginations of not just us, but the wider public.
Yeah. Has anyone else got anything to say about figurative art? There goes the mic, yep. It should be on. Oh, there we go.
Hello? Okay, there we go. So when I used to work at AFAR's Foundation, and I came into that space through a residency for curators. And one of the main topics, or one of the reasons why the residency was established, is to think about this thing called the critical middle. And I think to dovetail to what you spoke about earlier about journalism, is that there's what happens in the gallery, which sort of moves through the system of the curator, the gallerist, the artist. And when it reaches the public, is there massive addressability? Massive addressability is how far does this information reach? And who has access to that language? When I say epistemic tonton, a lot of people like tap out. They're like, what is this about? And I think a lot of art has sort of taken on this elitist sort of mode, where even as a curator, I find that when I listen to an artist-to-artist conversation, it's a beautiful conversation. But when artists speak to me, they want to intellectualize and sort of make their work, flourish or
and then dumb it
something
down
like
again
that.
for the journalists.
And I think, yeah, you know, and I think that has been the issue. I think like the bigger issue is sort of not thinking that an ordinary person or even a poor person, because you know what, poor people make art. You know, like that's the truth. You know, like poor people make art. So who has the language for art? You know, like I believe it's them. You know, like I believe it's people who make it,
Yeah.
who better than them. You know, and it's rare to find the artistic voice. I think that's why most collectors actually enjoy studio visits, because it's a humbling experience. It's so much closer to the truth than anything you get that's gone through all these filters. You know, I'm like going on a tangent now, but yeah, I think it's a language problem, like what's happening. And I think if we can find a language that's gentle, that's not elitist, that considers the listener, you know, and if we can fill that gap, you know, through journalism, through honest journalism, don't be afraid to say something as horrible. If it's horrible, it's horrible. You know, that's how we get to know you. If you know what I'm saying, if you don't like pancakes, and you don't say you don't like them, I'm gonna keep making pancakes for you, you know, and that's not gonna end well, you know. So that is my opinion. Yeah.
So we didn't get stuck on figurative art, which I thought we might. One of the other things. Oh, of course. Is it about pancakes? Because we might.
No, it's not about.
Feel free.
I have nothing to say about pancakes. No, but I mean, going back to what you were saying about a language, you know, I think that what puts people off of art, contemporary art today, is the feeling that they don't understand that language. They don't know how to speak it. They don't know how to communicate. And going back to the earlier panel today about education, educating the public, you can teach people how to speak that language, how to understand that language. And it's not very difficult, but it does have to start early on. And so going back to education is important. It's beyond just journalism. I mean, it really starts at as young an age as possible. It's about accessibility to the arts. It's about making these opportunities available to young families, to students. And so, you know, we think a lot about contemporary art today in the Middle East and and back home in Egypt, because there has been a lot of effort now to start including people and inviting people back into museums and into art spaces, because for a certain period of time, people felt excluded. And this exclusion is not just relative to Egypt, the Middle East, Africa. I mean, it is really a global matter, right? And so some countries, some institutions, some governments have been great at creating initiatives to include visitors. And we're not just talking us as an art public, because we really are the 1% in this whole scenario. But you know, where contemporary art is going, or where I should say contemporary art should go, it's about constantly reminding ourselves as practitioners that it is not just about us. It's not just for our consumption, but it's for the consumption by a large audience. And I think that's an important question that many artists think about, but it's a crucial question for curators, practitioners, foundations to think about.
And I think, oh, sorry, Louis, step in.
Yeah, maybe if I can jump in on this topic. The fear factor, the intimidation factor, we shouldn't underestimate in Africa. You know, if you grow up in Europe, you're surrounded with art. You know, there's sculptures in the streets. It's normal to go to art institutions, etc. In Africa, it seemed to be elitist, and it's a lot of people feel intimidated and they don't belong. So they don't go because they think, you know, people are going to think they're dumb, or people don't appreciate that. And we changed our strategy on education significantly just more than a year ago, and it maybe started off with a discussion I had with Zanele Moholi, which said, you know, you don't understand the barrier you're creating by building beautiful buildings, because they're becoming actually inaccessible. People think they don't belong there, and maybe you should consider taking campuses to the people. And we started off, we thought maybe we should do that, but then we actually changed the strategy exactly a year ago, we took out our shop and made it a learning center. It should be a preeminent space in the museum. And we said it's within our control to bring children there. And in the first year we did 7,000 children. This year we'll do 13,000, and next year we want to do 20,000 children. And over 80% of those children come from disadvantaged schools. And the joy and the happiness when you bring children there and then when they finish there is fantastic. So what do? We have to bring buses, bring them in by bus. And Shanas, who runs our program, says the first thing she has to do, she has to calm them down and make them feel at ease that they can go into this building. And then they walk in there and she first focuses on the architecture. So they don't, they're not confronted with art. They first start talking about architecture, and then inside we've got to be respectful and we can't touch, etc. And then she takes them into the sculpture garden. Now, a humbling thought is that most of those children that visit there, it's the first time in their life they're in a garden. We don't think of that. Now we think they should just come there and feel comfortable. And after a while, they can run around. They learn they can climb on the sculptures. They can touch them. They get taught about fauna and flora, respect flowers, etc. I mean, how can you expect somebody that's never been in a garden to respect the flowers in there? So it's totally different. And then, we started sadly in I think it's probably throughout Africa, but sadly in South Africa, there's no political economic will to support the arts. So there's no curriculum. In a lot of schools, art isn't taught anymore. So we educate the teachers as well. We started a program where we start building, we publish books. We've done 2 volumes, which becomes part of a curriculum of African artists, because that's what they can relate to. So each child receives one which they can take home. They then make a work of art which they can take home. So all of a sudden they arrive home with, look, I've made this. And then we also give them a snack pack and a drink. And they don't want to go because this is fantastic. It's a wonderful experience. And once you see that, then you realize learning starts at the bottom, because that child will go home and it'll tell its parents, where I went today. And they'll take their parents and they won't be scared and they'll feel at home. And I think the same goes for adults. So we start doing adult classes as well. But a lot of, embarrassment is a big fear. And people walk in there and people start talking about that. It's like walking into a wine club. And they say, can you smell the ash? Can you smell the oak? I say, what the hell? I just want to drink the wine,
I just want a beer.
Art. But that's the point. But then we walk into a museum, keep quiet. Children shouldn't run. What mother can enjoy a museum if all day she had to keep quiet, stand still, don't move, do this. So we want children to come there and run around and be happy. Every morning there are probably 60 children, and our offices are in the building. And we hear these happy voices. It actually makes you feel good and feel, subconsciously it has an enormous effect on you. So we got to break down these barriers of fear, of intimidation. Art should be part of everyday life. And I think William Kentridge a while said to me, he was posed with a question, he often gets posed with the question, when did you become an artist? He says, no, the other people just stopped being an artist, I just carried on. And I think that's what it's about.
Yeah. And I think everyone's going to count that one. I think what you described there, obviously it's playing such a pivotal role, and it's sort of recognizing the role that these infrastructures have in this process. So museums, foundations, galleries, there's still a big role to be played in that. And with that in mind, I wonder if we could explore another trend that often comes up, which is particular market interest around young artists. I hate saying young because I don't like this notion anymore, but sort of artists at the start of their career or earlier in their career, and there seems to be sort of a market pull towards those. So how that should or is being treated responsibly or not. Yes, I'm going to throw it to you.
Part of it is the human condition, right? We like new things, we like exciting things. So some of that's completely explainable. I think part of that trend is something that I think is the real worrying trend, collecting art over the past 100 years has been like supporting the local opera house. And I feel, and I think galleries are partly responsible, so I'm certainly looking at ourselves. I think auction houses are probably a little bit more responsible. I'm not going to read out the logo behind me. And then there's other parties that are way more responsible still. But because we needed the money to stay open, we have let this culture develop where buying art is more like buying Bitcoin than it is like supporting your local opera house. And I think that's really worrying. And I think the interesting young artist is part of that. Because a young artist, there's more chance that it will go up in value than an artist who's been around for a while. And we've seen some stories. So I think, yeah, the idea, I mean, that's why I don't know if I was like happy or disappointed that I wasn't on Serge's panel, because I heard him speak and, you know, the hairs in my neck stood up. Art really shouldn't be thought of as an investment. And to a large degree, it's a terrible investment. Most art funds that have existed and invested locally, including some funds managed by people in this room, haven't done particularly well. And those are some of the smartest people I know in the industry that have been working on these funds. So I think we need to educate the children, and Louis is doing a great job, but we also need to educate the people in this room, the people buying art, that it's an investment in common humanity, an investment in artists being able to do their groceries and buy their paint so they can keep making art.
So when you talk about the idea of the opera house as supporting, you're talking here about supporting a career rather than a moment, I guess, in a career.
That, but also I was thrilled to hear from Tristan that they're bringing in the philanthropy division of Investec and not just the asset allocation. Buying art shouldn't be asset allocation. It's great if you want to think of it that way so you can explain it to your parents, that's cool. But it should be philanthropy. You're supporting artists, you're making sure they're making a living. That's why you should buy it from galleries where the artists actually get half the money or such, rather than on the secondary market. It's about making sure that people like that, the most important people in this world, I believe, artists, musicians, that they can do their craft and sort of make us human and not just animals.
And to what extent do we think that's happening well or not on the continent? And that's a massive sweeping question. If anyone would like to take that on, yes.
I think that tailcoating on that comment, I think that one thing that we forget, and collectors particularly should remember, is that it's important to look at the long view of things. And unfortunately, in our life today, everything is fast, and we want everything to be consumed fast, done fast, gone through fast, and it's really a tragedy. But when you think about collecting, I think the thing that's important to inform and remind ourselves, collectors, and really to encourage artists to be patient about is this idea of time. Sitting with a work, developing a series of, or a body of work really thoughtfully, giving it time, giving themselves time. I think that the thing that drives me crazy the most with collectors is seeing a collector come in and snap up 3 paintings, you know, and sort of over-investing and just sort of putting this pressure on a young artist to sell a lot, to produce a lot. And, you know, I think that there is something wrong in how people collect and how people sell and how galleries are responsible for this as well. It's not just important to thoughtfully place a work of art with a responsible collector. And I think that every collector should think of themselves and try to emulate a habit of responsibility towards the artist and towards the ecosystem as a whole. But one thing that I think we always have to remind ourselves of, it's something that I truly tell people that I advise, is look at it in the long run, because this young artist, if all of a sudden overnight just has an entire show bought out and, you know, is being pressured to produce, well, that artist is going to burn out, and then there goes that artist, and then there goes that potential, and there goes your work and the value of what was inherently in that work. I mean, so, you know, I think that it really would behoove all of us to think about what we do when we encourage young artists. Yeah, Chris, do you?
I've got to take on just a little bit. We're not a philanthropic nation by nature. So, you know, it's hard to make a horse drink if he doesn't want to drink, you know, and the same goes with philanthropy. art starts with somebody buying a work of art, hopefully because I like it. And that should be the overriding factor. What is sad, it's like in the stock market. If you ask in this room, probably most people think they've got stocks, and a lot of them buy them themselves because they've got a tip or they've got this or that. And they know the facts. 75%, the S&P will outperform 75% of fund managers who spend their whole life trying to analyze stocks, but yet you'll buy your stocks and you think you're going to do it better. The nice thing about art is it beautifies your home. It gives you pleasure, hopefully, when you wake up. And that's why you should be buying it. I think what's become increasingly more important is once you start doing that when you buy something really nice, that you do it on an educated basis. So you go to, it's not like, okay, my tooth is sore, I'm going to my neighbor and saying, listen, won't you look at my teeth? And if you think there's something wrong, extract a tooth. You go to somebody and you get advice, somebody that knows a bit. But ultimately, if you take home a piece of art and you don't like it, you're doing yourself an injustice and the artist, because you think you're going to make money. I don't think, speculating in art's going to make a lot of money, as it is with probably most other things, and ultimately it's beautiful. It should be part of your furniture, part of your psyche, something you wake up. If you wake up in the morning and there's a work of art, and you're thinking, geez, I hope the market goes up and I'm going to make a lot of money. Just hang the dollar bill there. Maybe it'll increase against the rand and you've done better, but it's not going to make you happy. So fundamentally, it should be a joyous thing, something that gives you a lot of joy. But you also don't want to actually be buying something like a beautiful car that in 5 years' time is going to be worth half the value. So if you can preserve your money to a certain extent, and it gives you joy, that's a win-win. And I think that's what everybody should be looking at. And I think the biggest problem you have in funds is time horizons, because art, comes and goes, and if you've got a 5-year or 7-year or 10-year view and you under pressure, it's the same as funds. We don't like time-related funds because it's never the right time to sell, and and I don't think it's just a philanthropic thing. It's a self-fulfilling, feel-good thing. If you wake up the next morning, you must say, it's great, There's an old saying, people that buy yachts, there are only 2 days they like them, the day they buy them and the day they sell them. Art shouldn't be like that. You should like it every day, and I think once you do that, and it doesn't matter if you lose money on it or you never sell it, but it gave you a lot of joy that you cannot measure.
That own yachts and don't love yachts the whole time. They're very interesting people to me. But anyway, we picked up here a little bit naturally about the risk to the individual artists, and as an investment, the risks of sort of trends, if we want to call it that. But I wonder if there's a risk overall to the art market in the continent and its development. What are the risks there if there's a surge of trends, as it were? And I'm thinking about things like brain drain. I think that's something you brought up previously. I should give people more warning. Here we go.
I think Frank spoke about it, about how, like on the opening address, about how when artists actually start making it, they leave the country. And we keep seeing this over and over again because the market prospects are presumably better elsewhere. This speaks to what we were just talking about. I think the key, like what I'm getting from the whole education for collectors thing, is that once you educate a collector, collecting becomes a practice. And the word practice, suggests consideration, thoughtfulness, and a lot of artists that I've spoken to that have left, didn't feel those feelings. They felt like once they started doing great, and I see it, I've seen it before, once they start doing great, the demand goes up, and then you get these lists, waiting lists, you have to wait 3 years, and, like paying an artist before you even get the work, like all those kinds of things really start happening, and that's incredibly stressful, because it's like artists are not machines. Like art is not like Vitra, like where they can make an unlimited amount of chairs. You know, there's a certain inspiration, a certain spirit, a certain commitment to purpose that comes with being an artist that I think a lot of people who look at art as an investment, like purely as an investment and not something that, you know, has so much more value to it, you know, outside of the fiscal value, you know. So I think a lot of artists run from that, you know, run from that and then run into a different space in the hopes that things will be different, but things are not different. You know, I think the practice of education really, which is something that's been stressed here, when we talk about trends, I think that should be the trend. You know, I think like we were speaking about podcasts, like art podcasts in Africa. Nobody can name 5 art podcasts in Africa. You know what I'm saying? Like nobody, like anybody. You know what I'm saying? And it's sort of like that's like, I mean, we're digital, like a lot of this new generation are digital natives. All of us have these devices. Education doesn't have to happen at a museum or an institution. It can happen on your phone, you know what I'm saying? So there's a sense of personal investment that needs to happen. But yeah, I digress a lot, but you know, to speak about like brain drain and how like artists are leaving, I think it's primarily because they feel like once they start popping, everybody just wants a piece of them,
Yep.
and that's detrimental to the practice, you know. Yeah.
Anyone else want to add to that? Chris, yeah.
I gotta watch this distance. I hear you. I agree with you. I think it's an interesting phenomenon to watch people spreading their wings and moving abroad. And I know when I travel for fairs, you kind of have this very centered, clustered moment, especially in Europe, where you really see the intersection and interconnection of how much more highly concentrated those regions are in your chance connections with curators, your how much often you brush shoulders with collectors, with institutions, etc. But I must say, like I'm amazed by the artists who maintain that kind of pace nonstop. Like for me, I think I can see why Williams maybe stayed in Johannesburg, because he gets a bit of a reprieve from that. You know, he can step out into the limelight when he wants to engage with people at that sort of level, and then can like spend time working on, you know, his practice and whatnot. And I kind of have tried to take that same approach, and I think it's amazing. But I think on the young artist topic, I really think like it comes down to a community and an interconnected community of many different players. You know, like players in that person's life who reinforce their sense of identity and their ability to take control of the pace of their own career and to, you know, put the brakes on things when they're moving too fast. The ability to say no, which I don't think a lot of artists realize they have, you know. And a say in prices, you know, like to tell the European gallery that you're like amazed to even be working with that, no, I don't want my work to sell for that price, is something that I think, you know, artists should know they have the agency to have. So yeah, I think as the ecosystem grows, I think people become healthier the more immersed they are in community, and I think our community is growing. Like I at least see that. I feel good about it. Yeah.
And I think you mentioned actually on our call beforehand around an artist that had sold something on Instagram, and the risk of that sort of. The positives of the digital platforms are really clear, but some of those risks around not having that infrastructure and ecosystem around artists sort of working directly and selling to buyers in that way it is there, but obviously not just the content, but elsewhere too.
I mean, so there's this emergence of like the independent artist and them like gaining rapid growth over short periods of time, you know, and it's something to behold, you know. And over the past couple of years, I've seen artists sort of fall into that space and gain this fame on Instagram, and their work's really growing fast. You know, like I started, my first job was with BKZ, and we only work with independent artists, you know. And the whole idea was to put like emergent artists next to like artists that are established. But with most of those artists, when I track their career, a lot of their work has gained exponential value. And I think on the topic of trends, I think the next thing that's going to happen, because once we lose the mediators, who are usually the gallerists who mediate the work, who have things like know your customer, KYCs, like that kind of thing. Artists don't necessarily have that. And for a long time, artists have been doing that work themselves. I think the next thing is artists actually becoming like actors or musicians and having like A&Rs and like, like a business manager, like that kind of thing. A lot of like young artists that I know are looking into that space of sort of like turning yourself into an institution of sorts, you know what I'm saying? Because it is of a detriment to them. Like when your work rises from 20,000 to 500,000 in a couple of years, like I said, there's less people with 500,000. Like there's more people with 20,000 than 500,000. You know what I'm saying? So it's not like they're like naive or anything, or they don't see how like this affects their careers. But a lot of the conversations I've been having was, how do I build this infrastructure on myself? How do I maintain my independence but still have a sustainable career? So I think in the next couple of years, that's what we'll start seeing, like artists having people that care for them and not just, sending DMs of like, what's available kind of thing. Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm sorry for jumping.
I just wanted to jump in and say that, to your point, it's really been an amazing phenomenon to watch how artists have manipulated Instagram in particular to promote themselves and to connect with other artists and to connect with young collectors who can't afford even maybe a 20,000 rand or $20,000 piece, but can afford a $500 print. And there are new practices between collectors, young collectors, and young artists. And I think it's interesting to consider these models that are upending current models right now today with it. And I think that ultimately what's coming out of that is the ability for an artist in anywhere in Africa to connect with a curator anywhere else in Africa, over something that's just off their phone. And the result of that has been pretty amazing, or at least that's what I see in the work that I've been doing. I mean, artists have been introducing me to other artists that they've connected with, and they might not have met in person, but you wouldn't know it because they just know what the other person's working on. They're considering collaborations and future work, and they're trying to find other people to engage with that, whether it's sort of me as a curator or, it is really incredible to see what is going on right now, but it's also really exciting to think about what will happen in the future. Because like you said, these artists are they're sort of claiming a sense of agency. They're not so intimidated by these galleries abroad that used to always have the most visibility. And I think that there's been really a democratization of the art world thanks to social media and thanks to how artists have been manipulating social media for their own good and for their own sales. And I think it's also allowed artists to not worry so much and to sort of slow down that process of making it big, going out, selling, because they're also building communities. I mean, they might be virtual communities, but they are very strong communities. And I think, when we think about artists and where we're going in the future, I mean, it is about community building in whatever capacity that community might be.
And actually, you both jumped ahead. I mean, I was conscious of time, but ask I don't want to say trend, but this panel's about trends, so let's do it. What you see over the next 5 years, so what sort of key trends or growth areas do you see, whether for the artists or for the market more generally? We'll start with Joost.
If I could predict trends, I'd probably pick a different profession.
No pressure, everyone's waiting.
But I'm very heartened by the predictions I heard earlier. Louis saying that there's a real focusing in on quality after this growth, like zooming in on quality and art historical provenance, I think I hear you say. And Kansani is saying that we're seeing a turn towards abstraction. And if those two are true, then I think our program is in a pretty good place because we've got lots of historically vetted abstract artists. So I'm hopeful for the future based on predictions of other people, but I certainly don't want to predict the next 5 years.
We won't hold you to it. It's okay. Kinsani, do you have any other? I know you've talked about artists
I'm like
gaining
the
that
prophet.
independence.
I'm like the prophet over here. I see more like I see more art collectives popping up. I mean, on the topic of community, I think I was in Germany last year, and one of the things we were investigating was choral practices. Choral practices like working collectively, like like how can, for example, my practice fund your practice? Like if I do well, like can I get you material to make your art too, and I see young artists like doing that, using their own careers to support younger artists. I think that's something I really want to see like grow, sort of like not depending on someone buying your work, but depending on your community for your own expansion. I call it choral practice, but I think that's what's gonna happen like in the near future. I don't know if that's gonna result in like artists collaborating and making works together. I think that would be super interesting, to challenge ideas around authorship, which we've seen happen with things like NFTs, where most people who make them, those are not even their real names, so these modes of challenging authorship, which challenges the whole structure of art, because sign becomes signature and your signature is your name. So what happens if it's a pseudonym, So I'm interested in that, yeah.
I love how you throw NFTs in there as a light subject to sweep through, but obviously that's going to be an area. And Louis, looking into your crystal ball for the next 5 years?
I'm seeing a growing number of people entering the market as observers. Things like the Cape Town Art Fair.
Oh. That button. Or not?
I really believe we're going to have a lot more entrance into the market, and things like the Cape Town Art Fair, I think, are really important, because a lot of people go with their friends that have been before, and and it becomes vogue. It's actually vogue to go to the Cape Town Art Fair. Maybe 10 years ago, people didn't go there, and as a result, you'll see the numbers growing to things like the Art Fair, the Johannesburg Art Fair, and also, I'm hoping we'll see more in Africa. So I think a lot more people will just be exposed to art. It's up to the people in the art industry then to convert those people to people that start owning art or just appreciating art. We're so focused on people have to own art. Your eyes are sort of should be satisfied, and that's what art does. Or you can feel it, etc. You don't have to own it. We want to commercialize it because obviously it's a big industry. But if somebody went to the art fair and just went home and said, I saw 2 or 3 works that I really loved, or they really enriched my soul, I think that's where we start. Because unfortunately, art's an expensive hobby, and we can't expect everybody to own art. But we can actually make art available to people, and I think that's what, for instance, the Cape Town Art Fair is doing fantastically well. Is you'll see tonight people that you've never seen there, or tonight, I mean, later on in the week, and it'll grow year on year. And I think we should encourage people just to go, and we should buy tickets and invite people to come along, because it may just invoke something in them that really attracts them to art, and they don't have to become buyers. I think we don't, obviously it's important for the art practitioners, but people just enjoying a piece of art, I think that's the ultimate.
Brilliant. Any predictions?
I would like to see, I don't know if this is a prediction, but I would like to see a reverse brain drain. And I think that is happening in bits and pieces, with artists creating these online communities, with artists seeking new opportunities, but also really returning home. And so I think that my prediction is that, at least on the continent, there is going to be a reversal as things like the Cape Town Art Fair grows, expands, becomes more vogue, but also the collecting base becomes more educated and more developed, because then the ecosystem becomes larger, becomes stronger, and these foundations will allow artists to come back home and to do the work that they've been doing abroad. My other prediction is that NFTs are on their way out, but I didn't say that.
And just throw that in again. Brilliant. Chris, on that note.
Wow, quite a few predictions to top here. I don't actually know if I have any predictions. I think, like, even if, you know, the visibility moves away from African art and we focus on, you know, South American art, or go back to Asian art, or even Australasian art, or wherever we're going next, I think that there's room for, you know, artists to learn from what's happening in different contexts, and to see that there's like a universal spirit that I think runs through everything, and to, you know, to also realize that I think the world is both bigger and smaller than we realize, and your market, yeah, I think Jerry Saltz said something very interesting that I picked up on quite a few years ago. He said something like, an artist only needs 7 people in their career to really make it work. You need a gallerist that believes in you. You need 1 or 2 curators who will really put your work forward, and you need a writer who will encourage your work through their writing. And where am I at now? I'm at now for number 4. So, and then you need 3 or 4 consistent patrons. And I think speaking of trends, maybe something that I can introduce to this discussion is, I've definitely started to appreciate the encouragement that collectors who buy repeatedly from my work give to my practice. You know, because they're as they're seeing my work developing, they're buying into that, and you realize, like, oh wow, this is actually what like patronage is, and interestingly enough, it's those people who are then the most vocal about your work, who stand behind it the most, who put it forward for, you know, opportunities that come their way to show their collection. So, you know, instead of like maybe thinking of a trend as like, you know, 100 collectors going crazy over, you know, something and like trying to buy bits of it, you know, artists, even artists who I think are independents, who are considerate about where they place their work, and realize that, you know, a few very loyal supporters are maybe better than a crowd of 100. Who only have 1 or 2 of your pieces and don't really have a care for your practice is maybe much better. So yeah, I think hopefully, yeah, hopefully
as well. Yeah. Brilliant. Thank you. I think we're out of time. I don't know if we've got time for questions. I'm looking at someone to. Kate, do we have time for questions? Yeah. Well, does anyone have any questions first? That might be a good one to check. Yeah, we have one at the back. I think we've got time for a couple. I thought one in the back, and then the lady in green, I think.
Thank you so much for the very informative conversation. This is a question for all the panelists, if there's time. What kind of art do you each personally encourage and discourage?
Ooh. We might delve back into NFTs at this rate. Anyone want to jump in? I think we've got time for two encouragements.
Encourage NFTs. I think anything that's being made from a creative standpoint, from a creative volition, is important to be produced and put out in the world. What kind of art do I like to see? I like to see art being made that really can bring together a large group of people. So whether it's an outdoor sculpture, whether it's an interactive work, it doesn't have to be highbrow art. I mean, so often we dismiss something because it isn't considered to be highbrow or, you know, intellectually of value or academically in line with what, you know, is in trend. But, you know, I think anything that really pulls people together is really important.
Anyone else? Got time for? No one else wants to encourage art? There we go.
I'll speak as a curator. I'm with you, like I wouldn't discourage anything. Even though I have my own issues with NFTs, but what I would encourage people, like as somebody who curates a lot of new media and works for an institution that's the biggest online art market in Africa, I would encourage more people to make video art and more collectors to actually start collecting new media. I think that's so important. I think that gap is such a huge gap in South Africa. You know, it's insanely huge. Like, we can't have one collector collecting video art, you know, and you can watch it over and over again, man. It's cool. And I mean, what I like about it and why I would like to encourage people is because video art has the ability for massive addressability. It can reach millions of people. That message that you have as an artist, if there's any artists in here, can reach so many more people, you know, and that's beautiful, you know. Yeah.
It's a good one. Right, I think we've got time for another question. I think there was one in the back. A lady in green. There we go. And then we might be out of time, I think.
Could you expand a bit on what is in your mind when you spoke about quality art?
Quality art. Anyone want to expand? Louis, can you explain quality art? No pressure.
Quality art.
It's a good little warm-up every time, isn't it? I think if you press that one there. If it's green, it's good. Yeah.
Quality art is probably in the eye of the beholder, and I'm certainly not an expert on the topic. But I think what people look for in art is something it's art that's created, and anything that's copied is probably not quality art. You know, if you just copy or follow somebody else and you see that one's successful and you do something, you know, likewise. But you know, if you start looking more academically at Africans, artists that have become that have really become part of art history, it's probably just a handful, and those are those artists that have changed the way in a way that something's happened, and there are some examples, but you know, they're very rare, so it's difficult to only collect art history artists. But I think in the long run, those will become global icons. But I'm not sure, you know, there's one definition to it. What I'm very convinced of, if you see an artist over a long period of time just churning out the work and selling it and the market's lapping it up, I don't think that's art. I think that's just a factory doing something. So art is taking something from nothing and producing something which people then will interpret in a way that was probably not interpreted before. I think then you've probably got artists that are really applying their mind. But you know, we often hear the adage is, even my child could do that. But the question is, can you do it? I think that's probably the real question.
On that note, I think we're out of time for questions. I'm looking, I don't know if Kate wanted to say a few remarks before we close. She's running at pace. Here we go.
You have me running, but I'm very happy to run. Thank you all so much. This was absolutely wonderful. Firstly, thank you to the Art Business Conference and Louise Hamlin, who is in London joining us by the stream, the cloud, the YouTube. Thank you to Ria, who's a brilliant moderator and chair. Thank you very much. I then wanted to say thank you to the panelists. Your voices are crucial. They are critical. And today, I think we all have a common purpose here. From Cape Town, we may be at the bottom end of the world, but we work together in this idea of the art ecosystem. So auction houses, galleries, the art fair. We all have a common purpose, and that is something that Strauss takes very seriously. Our interest in selling art, yes, but our interest goes far deeper than that. It is about educating a community, educating children, as Louis said, educating young adults. We launched our art club in Johannesburg last week, and the response was very, very encouraging. There's a lot of learning to be done. There's a lot of thinking to be done, and there's a lot of sharing. It's about dialogue, and this was a very good example of dialogue today, so thank you for that. The inspiration for this conference sits within our vision, which is to promote a greater collaboration, greater conversation and dialogue across the African continent. Strauss, an African business, has buyers in 68 countries. We have registrants in over 100, well, in 101 countries to be exact. This is a very strong reach, and with that reach comes a responsibility. Comes a responsibility around education, talking. And this began long ago, but specifically this began 3 years ago with the conference around Mancoba and the Cobra Group. Last year we had a conference around figuration, African figuration and exhibition, a non-selling exhibition, so commitment without a price tag attached. And tonight we open our exhibition, which is entitled Curatorial Voices. It is a collaboration of guest curators across the continent. So the Strauss specialists, obviously in South Africa. We have Dana here tonight from Kinshasa. We have Hiba on the panel from Cairo. We have collaborators, guest curators from Harare, from Cairo, from Nairobi. I was forgetting Nairobi. So we're very excited to lead this dialogue in greater voice across the continent. Please do join us next door right now for the exhibition that is opening. I think the last thing I wanted to say, two things if I could. Goma touched on this in the first panel, but she touched on the importance of responsible pricing. I think that is very, very important. And when we curated this auction, this sale, we thought a lot about the pricing. We have a lot of very well-known, very well-respected, very highly collectible artists. But we also have a lot of young artists, new to market, new to auction. And so how do we price this responsibly? It's something we considered. I also wanted to say, and to quote, a little bit of Just's opening when he talked about passion. Buying art is about passion. Looking at art is about passion. If you love it, and come and look tonight, if you love it, buy on it, bid on it. If you don't, that's fine too, but do look. I think the most important thing we're talking about here today is look, ask, think, grow, learn. And I think we can do that together. So thank you all very much.
Oh, I might be on my mic.